wanting to connect with Irene again, and I love it when we have a collaboration that immediately can start, and then I just didn't hit record fast enough because it's like we should have already started this. So we're kind of jumping right in because you were on in the past, Irene, and um, you've got a new. It's kind of a focus, I guess, of the that has kind of come out of the work that you do. And so let's just dive into what's the highly sensitive person and all of that. How does that come to be?
Yes. Well, thank you again for having me here. Love this show and love to talk to your audience. And my work has always been around focusing on sexual desire in a long-term relationship. What happens, particularly for the woman? Certainly, the story of sex is hot in the beginning, and then things go south when there's children, when you have several decades of marriage under your belt. What happens? And as I've been working on that for over a decade, I started to see some patterns. And that one of them is that women struggling with sexual desire in a long-term relationship tend to be very responsive. And what I mean by that is that there's two general types of sexual desire models. There's the spontaneous, which most men have, and there's the
Hmm.
responsive, which most women have. Certainly not all, but most. And women who are struggling with sexual desire in a long-term relationship tend to be highly responsive. They're responsive to their environment. They're responsive to the energetic and emotional connection in the relationship. Parallel to that, I started to also notice that these women were also highly sensitive.
Okay.
And I started to realize that high sensitivity, HSP, highly sensitive people, high sensitivity is also called high responsiveness, that highly sensitive people are very responsive to their environment, be it sensorially to the sensory inputs, but also energetically and emotionally. And so I
Okay.
started to piece these things together. And the framework that I have invented that I call connection sex, which is something that I talked about last time on the podcast, seems to really powerfully work for highly sensitive women, but also highly sensitive men as well. And so that's kind of where my work naturally went, is seeing that connection and thinking about how can we bring more awareness to what highly sensitive means and what special needs there are in a relationship, or specifically in the sex life of a relationship. What needs to happen to bring out the best of highly sensitive people instead of the worst, which is the shutdown, the withdrawal,
Right.
the loss of libido.
Right. So there's two things that come to my mind with this, Irene. One is the definition of terminology, because I hear highly responsive and highly sensitive. Responsive and sensitive, those are almost dichotomies in my mind in the way they're interpreted. One's more positive, one's more negative, in the way I hear it initially. So I want to flesh that out. And then the other, which I imagine we'll spend the bulk of the time on, is what are the conditions necessary then that cultivate a better connectedness within that dynamic of the people involved. So let's start with the wording first, because is that kind of the same the way it hits me? Is that the way it hits you?
Yeah, so there's definitely different connotations, and the official term is HSP, highly sensitive person, and that was coined by Dr. Elaine Aron back, I believe, in the 70s or 80s. So this term has been around for a while, and responsiveness is just a synonym for sensitivity, but it does have a different connotation and has a more
Hmm.
positive connotation than sensitivity, which traditionally has been seen as a weakness, right? You're
Yeah.
sensitive, you're
Yeah.
dramatic, you overreact.
that's
All those
that's what I hear too. Is that, oh, why are you always so sensitive about that, rather than why are you always so responsive? That's a whole different connotation.
things. It's a whole different connotation. And again, it allows us to bring the best out of people versus the worst, which is the defensiveness. I'm not sensitive. I'm not dramatic.
Right.
And yes, so some of that is really important, how we speak about it and what words we use to describe that. But what it means, so being highly sensitive, highly responsive, is that highly sensitive people have a sensitive nervous system wiring. So
Okay.
there's there's definitely more input that gets registered. So in a way, it's like you hear more noise in the world, and that's kind of the primary way that we think of this sensitivity is sensorial. So all this the sense what our senses are picking up. So we pick up a lot more noise in the world, but that's not where it stops. Actually, HSPs have a brain that spends more time processing that information. So not only is there more noise, but there's more time spending on each piece of information.
Okay.
And highly sensitive people, for example, will spend more time evaluating details around them. If there is an emotional event, highly sensitive people will spend more time evaluating the emotional context, what that meant, what that was about. And that takes an enormous amount of energy, both processing all those
Mm-hmm.
inputs, but then also making sense of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the big pieces when it comes to highly sensitive people is overwhelm from all of this, right? From the sheer amount of noise to processing each and every piece. And from overwhelm, you have overstimulation, and naturally there is exhaustion, shutdown, withdrawal, but also a sense of armoring, right? I have to protect myself. I have to numb myself against all of this because at some point
Okay.
the nervous system just gets overloaded. And if you cannot
Sure.
handle so much, right, you have to somehow protect yourself. And that's a big piece when it comes to the relationship and sex. You have to go through a process of de-armoring. You have to go through a process of, first of all, overcoming the overwhelm and the overstimulation by coming down, by reestablishing uh, calm in the nervous system and peace in the nervous system, but then also go through this de-armoring process. And I'll
Okay.
talk more about that when we talk about these, what I call pre-sex needs that highly sensitive people need in order to engage fully sexually in a
And Irene,
relationship.
have you found what are some of the aspects and characteristics that create some of this in people? I mean, there could be a biological component. Is there an environmental component? I mean, I'm just curious that we the way we started the conversation was a lot of women were responsive and a lot of men are spontaneous, and that's Nagalski, and there's several different terminologies that are varying along the same dynamic. But with this particular aspect, because I see this a lot in the way you're framing this of people that it's like uh, they are aware and attuned to more going on around them, like the noise, and it impacts them dramatically different than other people. And so, have you found what helps kind of make a predisposition, if you want to use that terminology, for this?
So I believe we're born this way because there
Okay.
have been many brain studies looking at the brains of highly sensitive people and non-highly sensitive people,
Okay.
also highly sensitive versus autistic or highly sensitive versus introverted. And there's different activation in the brain that's happening. According to Elaine Aron, 20 to even more recent studies show 30% of the population is born this way.
Okay.
And so that is something we're born, but then also the environment makes a huge difference. If we're growing up in an environment where that sensitivity, that responsiveness is welcomed, where it's seen as a gift, we're going to be more relaxed, more open, and have our needs met. If we're
Okay.
growing up in an environment where it's called being dramatic and you're being oversensitive and just stop that kind of upbringing, well, there's going to be actually more trauma,
Okay.
right? So highly sensitive people are more likely to be traumatized by attachment traumas, by situations in their childhood that would not affect others, but affect them even more deeply because, again, everything is felt, everything is experienced so much more deeply, so much more intensely than what a non highly sensitive person
Hmm.
would experience. I wanted to add to three other areas of high sensitivity because how we think about highly sensitive people is primarily as sensitive on the sensory level, but there's two more or three more areas that are really important that also very much tied to the environment in a long-term relationship. And so, in addition to sensory sensitivity, there's emotional sensitivity. So, HSPs feel a lot and feel things deeply.
Okay.
And so, you have this full range of what you can feel from ecstasy and incredible joy to despair and agony. And so both ends of the spectrum get felt very, very deeply. There's also the need for an emotional partner, excuse me, a need for a partner to meet you emotionally. That because highly sensitive people are processing their emotions all the time, they need a partner to meet them there. That they of course, they want to be alone in that. And
Okay.
when I say they, I also mean we, because I'm a highly sensitive person. And so that emotional connection is incredibly important. Without it, there's a sense of I'm alone, I'm a freak. Why am I feeling all of this? Why do I
Right.
need this kind of support? So emotional connection is incredibly important. Another level of sensitivity is energetic. So highly sensitive people are known to be empaths. They can walk into the room and read the room instantaneously.
Okay.
And that is about really reading the energy of other people. And of course, in a relationship, you have two people, you have families of multiple people where everyone has their own mood. And a highly
Right.
sensitive person take on everyone's mood
Right.
and will kind of either veer towards the person with the strongest mood or the strongest personality, or be confused by all these different moods and not being able to make sense or process that. And so in a relationship, again, we have people with their own moods or where you have circumstances of life affecting you. For a highly sensitive person, they're going to be very, very dependent on that. And so
Okay.
that's an important element. And the last piece is introspection, not introversion. That's completely different
Right.
thing. Introspection. And that is the ability to look within yourself, to understand, to be aware of what's happening in you, to make sense of it. And highly sensitive people have a very rich inner life, a very rich inner world where there's a lot of particular focus on purpose, on meaning, on how things make sense. And with this one in particular, highly sensitive people tend to get stuck there, tend to
Okay.
overanalyze, try to make sense of something that may not make sense at all, like the many paradoxes in life. And but that's an important piece to understand when it comes to sensitivity. It's not just sensory, it's on all these different levels.
Yeah. Perfect. And so let's pivot into uh, when you recognize this going on in your dynamic or in you. What do you do? The de-armoring process. I think that's a very descriptive term. It's it's really good. But let's start unpacking. How do you now get to the level of connectedness when there's so much stimuli, if you will, coming at you that it's hard to make sense of and then be there?
Yeah. So that's actually the first piece. Before de-armoring, it's understanding that you have been overstimulated by life,
Okay.
right? Just getting, let's say, to work for most people is battling through traffic, sitting in on loud, noisy highways, or dealing with getting kids out of the house and coworkers on the way, and again, so many things. And so that's just the morning. Take the whole day, and highly sensitive people by the end of the day are typically overstimulated. And so
Okay.
that's the first piece, is to acknowledge that, check in with yourself and acknowledge that, and take some time to ground yourself. Take time to come back to yourself. It's usually in a quiet setting. I teach my clients to take 5-10 minutes in the car before you get out of the car when you get home. Listen to music or nothing at all.
Right.
Feel your butt on the seat, notice your breath, come back to yourself. And that's essential because so we're talking here about sex in a relationship. Sex is stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot pile on more stimulation on top of overstimulation. That is a disaster. That's a nuclear bomb waiting to blow up.
Yes, it
And
is.
so you need transition moments. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, is having this transition between, let's say, work and then home. And then when you get home and let's say you're making dinner, helping kids with homework, putting them to bed, and then another transition time before you can then step into an intimate space with a partner.
Mm-hmm.
And more transition times you have, the more opportunities to again get quiet, to come back to yourself, the more you have a chance to lower that overstimulation and to come back in a neutral, in an open way rather than the armored way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first piece. And the that allows you then to start to de-armor. And the de-armoring happens in two ways. One is emotionally. Well, we also, as highly sensitive people, we have to harden against the world, right? Grow tough skin, as the
Right.
saying goes. And so, well, that's exactly the opposite of intimacy, because intimacy
Yeah.
is opening up, it's vulnerability, it's showing the insides. And so what's really important is to have opportunities to be lovers in the relationship on an emotional level. And what I mean by that is having a heart to heart conversation, not just focusing on the particulars of the day of who did what and what the bills are and how work sucks, but to find out, hey, well, what was the best part of your day, or what scared you the most about, I don't know, what happened to our kid today in
Right.
school, or what are you worried about, and start to open up emotionally. And that starts to melt in a way the person, right? The armor starts to come down. And that's the second of what I call the pre-sex needs. So the transition in terms of overstimulation, and then the emotional de-armoring.
Okay.
And the third one is on the physical level. Again, sexual connection is about stimulation. And one of the biggest pieces that I've seen when it comes to highly sensitive people in general, but particularly women, that is that you have to take it slow. That the body, which is run by the nervous system, needs to
Mm-hmm.
take time to drop in, to feel like, okay, I'm safe. I don't need to be on. I don't need to be hyper vigilant. That part of the brain starts to relax. And then you start to actually welcome touch. So many women, I cannot tell you how many, complain to me saying that my partner reaches out and it hurts. Like, I don't want to be touched. I'm repulsed by the touch, or I'm hurt by the touch. And
Right.
that's because it's done before the de-armoring has happened. They're not ready. They don't feel emotionally connected, and the touch is too early, too soon. And so, on a physical level, there needs to be a slowing down. There needs to be a removing of the goal of sex from touch and focusing on touch that's first affectionate and comforting, to then progressively more sensual, still without the goal of sex, but sensual, to then, when there is a green signal, to progressively go to sexual. A lot of people don't have the patience or the time, to be honest, in a modern life to do this. This is what
Right.
highly sensitive people need, is this slow, spacious progression. And that's
Right.
again so that the nervous system gets this message of, it's safe. No one's going to rush you. No one's going to pressure you. It's okay. And
Okay.
then it can get turned on.
Okay. And so what you're describing as I'm hearing this, Irene, this is one that it's important that there's a collaboration involved, but it's also important that the highly sensitive person starts the process on their own too, because that's that transition element. That's that awareness of putting themselves in a better position or intent or transition. I love the idea of margin. I think we suck in large part at margins in our lives of transitioning from one thing to another to another to another to another, and it overwhelms everybody. And so a lot of times learning that, but I think it's also important to see it on a marital level and on a sexual level, that there's an individual thing going on and a relational thing going on. It's not one or the other. It's both.
Absolutely. And
So,
another word for that is self-care. So we're all responsible for our self-care, and we need to build in those transition times and partner with our partners to make sure that that happens. So it's
yeah,
letting them know that, for example, what I said earlier about sitting in the car before getting out. It's like, hey, when I pull up, just know that I'm going to sit there for 5 minutes. Please don't,
yeah,
wave at me. Don't come out to get me. And don't be mad at me that I'm ignoring you, right?
right.
I need that time.
Yeah,
Negotiating for those spaces
that's good.
or and that's to ensure that we're available to our partners.
hmm That's so good. Well, Irene, it's so good to connect with you again. So how can people find more of you and your work?
My website is has a wealth of information on this topic and on a sexual desire in a long-term relationship, and it's my name, irenefehr.com. And of course, you can find ways to work with me as well on there.
Perfect. Well, Irene, all the best and all that you do with couples, and love the fact that you have a target similar in the sense of long-term relationships of how let's all help them be better. So good to see you again.
Thank you so much.